Okay, this is Dr. Corey Glenn, and I'm going to be doing some demonstrations of how to use the Blue Sky Bio software, and so we'll just go through several cases. So in this case, I'm going to start with case one. Now, when you do this, you need to always select New Project. Many times people make the mistake of going to Open Project. If you do that, you're not going to be able to find any of your files. So go to New Project, start from a patient CT, and we're going to choose case one, or if you're doing your own case, this would be wherever you have that stored. Okay, so it's always wise to, the first thing, limit your CT field of view, because the more data that the computer has to crunch, the more it's going to slow down and potentially have crashes on you if your video card and memory is not up to spec. So I would advise the first thing you should always do is get the occlusal plane parallel to the floor. You can do that by grabbing the blue rotation ring, and then you should use these sliders to limit the field of view. Now in this case, it's going to be a mandibular first molar, and so we don't really need the cervical spine, we don't need most of the maxilla, we don't need the hyoid bone or any of that, so you can see how much we've eliminated much of this data that really isn't going to contribute anything to our treatment planning. So once I've done that, I click OK. And this is what's going to come up. Now we have multiple windows showing right here. I'm going to just go ahead and delete all these that are showing up on the side. So just to give a quick run through of what these windows are, this is your 3D rendering window. Now to rotate a model, you're just going to left click and hold, and you can spin that model in space. If you want to zoom in, it's right click, push and hold, and then you can zoom in and out. And then if you push the right and left mouse buttons at the same time, you can bodily move it. Now it's worth mentioning here, these are all functions that are going to be incredibly difficult for you to do if you're trying to use a trackpad on, let's say, a laptop. Make sure you use a mouse for this, otherwise you're going to get extremely frustrated. Going up here, this is the cross-sectional window. If I just use the scroll ball in this window, you can see it tracking through the volume. And so we can see it in cross-section. And now this is correlating to the red, yellow, and blue lines right here. So blue, yellow, red, these are all slices which are 1 millimeter apart. And it's not a cross-section through the patient, it's a cross-section through this panoramic curve. Now that panoramic curve can be modified as necessary. So just remember, this is always a cross-section through the curve. Same things here, you can zoom in and out with your right mouse button, although that's generally not advised. You could bodily move it. And so you can also use the slider to navigate through this. And if you want to maximize any of these windows, you can click on this Maximize Restore button. It will make it full screen. Now moving on to this middle top panel, this is the axial slice. This is as if you were looking at the patient from above. And so you can see as I scroll up and down, it's got a blue outline, and you can see this blue line moving as I do that. So we can scroll up and down through the patient's teeth and see everything in that volume. Same thing, right and left mouse button is going to bodily move this. Right mouse button is going to zoom in and zoom out. And then the scroll ball is going to just navigate up and down, as well as using the slider here. Now, a very important thing is present in this window, and that is the panoramic curve. The panoramic curve sets your view for really everything else in the software. And so we want to make sure that that's following the teeth nicely. We'll come back to that here in a moment when we do the nerve mapping. Upper right-hand window, this is the tangential view. And so it's green. You can see that correlates to this green line in the panoramic curve. And this is a tangent. If you spin your mouse ball, you can run that in a tangent to the cross section. Now that doesn't seem all that useful, and really it's not in this situation, but once we have an implant in the case, that will be very important, because you can click on the implant and then spin it on its axis to see it from all the different views. And then finally, this is the panoramic window in the bottom right. You can see this one looks exactly like a panoramic X-ray. And this is known as what's known as the composite view. And so the composite view is stacking all of the images that fall within this 3D curve, the panoramic curve, and it's giving us a composite rendering of those. So everything within this focal trough is what's composing this image. If I now take this and click on the the black and the yellow button, that's going to switch to the slice view. Now slice view, as it would imply, is going to change it from a trough into a single slice through the panoramic curve. And now this is very useful for the nerve mapping, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But by taking these things to the left and right, I can make the nerve show up really nicely through here. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. So that's a little tour through the software. Let's now begin actually planning this case. So in this case, we're going to be doing this lower left first molar. First thing you should always do on a mandibular case is to map the nerve. Now there's multiple ways of mapping the nerve. I'm going to show you both of those. Let's first do what's known as the automatic nerve mapping. So if I come up here and I click on the plus N, that's plus nerve, I can go up here and say detect nerve. Now when I click on that, a little window comes up and it says click inside the mental foramen, and it shows you where to click. And so as you might have noticed, I had already centered my view on the mental foramen, and so I'm going to just go up and do as it tells me, click inside the foramen, and as you can see, the software is going to auto detect the nerve. And other than dropping off right here where it exits the mandible, that really did a nice job. We could scroll through this in cross-section and see that that's accurate. If you wanted to actually change any of those, you'll notice as you scroll through, sometimes it goes from the yellow circles to a little white circle. Those white circles are the nodes of the nerve, which you can grab and move to modify its position. But that looks really nice. I'll tell you, in general, that auto function is only going to work when you can typically see a pretty nicely made out nerve canal. If you can't see that nerve canal really clearly, I would advise against using that auto detect function, because you're probably not going to get a reliable nerve map. Once you're happy with it, you can click the lock button. And now for the other side, let's do it the manual way. And so what I'm going to do for manual mapping is I'm going to go back over here and switch to the slice view. That's the black and yellow button. And when I do that, you're going to notice that by grabbing any of these nodes in the panoramic curve, I can drag them to the right or to the left, and I can make that nerve canal come into view. Do you see that? And once I get that one in view, I'm going to grab the next node down, and I'm going to start positioning it. We're going buccal and lingual with that until we can see it coming, showing up clearly throughout the entire length of the nerve. Okay? And just continue on. And as you can see right here, that is where the nerve is exiting the mandible. So now you can more or less see a continuous canal all the way through the mandible here. Once I have that in view, very simple, just go up and click on Add Nerve, and you're just going to click your way down the canal. Now this is the most reliable way of mapping a nerve, and if you do the auto detect and it doesn't work, this is how you need to approach it. Now, as I get up here to where the mental foramen exits, you notice I stopped right here. Once I can see it in the cross-sectional view up here, I'm going to now quit clicking in this window, and I'm going to go up here and click my way out of the nerve. So now I'm going to click once at the mouth of the foramen, and then one more time out in space. And then this is important. If you don't now shut that button off or deactivate it by unchecking this red box, then the next place you click, it's going to continue dropping those nerve points. So very important that you deactivate that nerve button. I could now grab any of these nodes and modify it as far as positioning is concerned, but the way I've done this, that's a very reliable way. There shouldn't be any need to modify that in any way. If you wanted to evaluate for an anterior loop, you could look in the axial section right here and see if it swoops forward. In this case, it does not. So I'm going to lock this nerve now, and we have now both nerves mapped completely for this case. All right, so the next thing that I'll do, I'm going to go back to the composite view just because I like the way that shows up best. And now we're ready to bring in the STL model. Now there's two things necessary to do guided surgery. You need the cone beam data and you need an STL model. There's multiple ways we can get that STL model, but for starters in this case, we're just going to assume that your lab generated you this STL, or you used a desktop scan or something to that effect that just gives an optical STL model. Go to File, Import STL Model, and this one is going to be in my folder under New BSB Course Files, Case 1 Gingiva. It'll depend on where you have saved this case. But once I do that, I'm going to click OK. Now, this is the auto stitching function, and we might be undergoing some changes with this soon, because right now I don't feel that it's really the most accurate way to stitch, so I don't want it to necessarily default. It oftentimes works, and when it does, it's amazing and it's fast, but really I want it to be 95% of the time before we auto default to that. So I'm going to show you both ways of stitching, but let's go ahead and do this and just see how it does. You'll have your STL model on one side, you'll have your panoramic window on the other side, and it's worth mentioning too that if you don't see it like that, it may be that you need to check off the slice view. You also need to have your panoramic curve set nicely to follow the arch before you do this. But all we have to do in this method of stitching is we need to place common points from tooth to tooth. Now, this does not have to be on the exact same position of each tooth. This is just make sure you put your points on the same teeth from one view to the other. The way I'm doing that is I'm pushing the shift button on the keyboard, and then I come over and I push shift and I left click on this. And I'm going to go around the arch just doing this, basically clicking every other tooth until I get all the way around. Once I do that, you can see I have 7 points on either side. I'm going to click Align. And the software now is going to try and do its best job of auto-stitching that together. And as you can see, it's very close. It's hard to tell from this view whether it's an ideal stitch, so I'm just going to click OK, which will take us back to the home screen. Now, how do we evaluate the stitch? That's a great question that we need to explore. And the way that we do that is that we look at this model outline. So if I went to Panels and went to Surfaces panel, all of your surfaces that you import are going to show up here. So I could change the color of this model, and I like to choose a nice bright pastel type color because it shows up nicely. And your hint right here is just this model outline. So you want to make sure that that is checked on. Also, if you're not seeing the 3D rendering of it, that would be the visible. You can see when I uncheck that, that turns that off. Here's where you can also turn on and off the CT surface, and in this case we don't really need that at the moment, so I'm going to turn it off to give a cleaner view. Now, we want to look in two different views to verify the accuracy of the stitch. The first is in the axial view. And what I want to see is when I scroll up and down through these cusp tips, I want to see that the model outline and the CT rendering are showing up at the same time or disappearing. Now this side over here is looking really nice, but do you see over here how I've got cusp tips appearing and the model outline is not showing up yet? That is indicative that this stitch is not perfect. It's very close, but it's not perfect. We could explore that further in the cross-sectional window, so I'm going to maximize that. And here you can see I'm zoomed in on that side where it didn't look like an ideal stitch, and you can see this model outline is just a little bit off. It's maybe only 1 millimeter, but that's still enough that I would want to improve on that. Now as we go around the arch, again, on the other side it was pretty darn close, and so I don't see much problem over there. But this is the most important step in the entire process. If you don't nail your stitch, you need to not proceed further because your guided surgery is only as accurate as your stitch is. So to show you the other method of stitching, I'm going to go back and stitch this the old school way. I think you need to know how to do both, and if you don't have an ideal stitch by the measures I just showed you there, you need to go back and restitch this manually. So to do that, go to Panels, open up your Model Manipulation panel. This is the panel where you'll do all the moving around of models and stitching. We're going to be stitching this Case 1 gingiva model. It's the mandible, and we want to choose points as our method of stitching. Now I'm going to click on Align. Once that's been done, and I made a little mistake here, you can see when I go back and try to stitch this, that maxilla is going to be in my way because here I need to pick really specific points from one model to the other. So let me cancel out of that and show you what I should have done first. Go back to your Surfaces panel, turn on your CT, and select the CT. Just click it so that it's blue, and then down at the bottom of this there's a button that says Isolate. When I click that, it's red. That means it's active. I'm going to click on the mandible. And when I do that, everything that is not mandible is going to disappear. And now that won't show up when I get into the stitching window. Now for what it's worth, if you do your isolate on say a different case and it doesn't isolate, there's a very likely chance that either the teeth are too close and the software thinks that the upper and lower jaws are touching, or you might have a lot of metal scatter in one or the other of the arches that is creating artifacts that connects the two together. In either case, you'll have to do some manual cutting to get those surfaces separated. All right, now back to the model manipulation panel, points, align, and let's try this again. Okay, so much better. I'm going to maximize this by clicking the maximize button, and this time it's very important that we put the same points on the same teeth in the exact same position. Okay, so I do that by first positioning the models in the exact same manner, in the same orientation. It just helps me to orient things better. And the same thing, I'm going to push shift, drop a point, and then I need to come to the exact same spot, shift and drop a point. Now what I'm looking for is distinctive areas, cusp tips, occlusal grooves, incisal edges, wear facets. All of those things are going to make very distinct stitching points, like this big wear facet right here on the canine. That shows up very nicely. Incisal edges like this one right in the middle. Okay, so I can go around and I need to pick 6 to 10 points. Really less than that, you might struggle to get a good stitch. More than that, you're going to get diminishing returns and probably increase the chance that you placed a point not so good and mess things up that way. Alright, so this is 8 points, and now I'm going to click OK. Now, when I click this, I want you to watch the change in that model outline orientation, and you should see it improve. Alright, so that was very, very quick. You may not have seen it, but now let's scroll up through the cusp tips. Do you see now how much better adapted this is? The cusp tips are disappearing at the same rate as the model outline. Everything is nicely adapted. Same thing over here. When I scroll over to this area where things had not been adapted well earlier, you can see now that it's following exactly to the tooth surface. So a great stitch. I'm very happy with that. Once I've got a good stitch, I have no need of having this CT scan rendering on. In fact, it only clouds up the view. So I would suggest going to Surfaces, unchecking visible on the CT surface, and now you can have this much cleaner view to look at. Alright, so the next step, we need to add a tooth. If we're going to do prosthetic treatment planning of our implant, we need to know where the prosthesis would be. So come up to plus tooth, and we can select which tooth we're going to be adding, click OK, and this will drop into any of the views. I'm going to just drop it into the pan, and once I do that, we can position it from any of the views. Now if I was to zoom in on this, you can see that a little widget appears every time I hover over it. If I was to grab the widget, the rotation ring, I can rotate it. If I was to look at it in the 3D view, which is where I prefer to manipulate this, if I click on the red of the tooth itself, it will bodily move it. But if I was to grab this rotation ring, it will rotate it. Okay? Now there's also nodes sticking out to the side. Those stretch the tooth. And so I'm going to stretch the tooth up to the size it should be, get it to where it fully fills the edentulous space. Now I want to look at it from every different angle and ensure that I've got this positioned appropriately. So here you can see it may be sticking up a little tall. Oops, wrong button. So if you ever mess up like that and accidentally grab something you shouldn't, there's a back arrow here, undo. So I want to grab the red of the tooth to pull that down. I could maybe rotate it slightly this way, and I could stand to bring that here. All right, that looks really nice. So I'm going to lock that now. You can lock it by right-clicking the tooth and pushing lock. And you really need to do that because otherwise you'll accidentally knock that out of position. Now finally, we're ready to virtually plan the implant. So minimize this. And once I've got the tooth in position, I can come up here and do plus implant. Now for this, I'm going to do a Biomax 5.0 by 10. This patient happens to have an incredible amount of bone, and so we can put a large diameter implant in. There are other systems in here. You could do all of these other systems which are listed, but we're going to stick to Blue Sky here because that's what I prefer and use. Choose the implant orientation, whether mandible or maxilla. One other thing I like to do is go up here and insert an abutment. So if you go to abutment, you could select any of these stock abutments that are available in the software, but you can also go to custom abutment. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put in a custom abutment and I'm going to make the length 20. The only purpose in me doing that is so that I can see where an emergence hole would be. Now I'm going to click in the software anywhere you want to drop this in, and it will place the implant. Just like with the tooth, you'll get a rotation ring. You can rotate this so I can line it up to the implant or to the adjacent teeth's long axis. And once I've done that for a rough positioning, this is where that tangential view becomes very useful. Okay, I'm going to stretch out the panoramic curve, which widens this trough, and then I'm going to just maximize this. So the reason this is useful is that I can see just quickly at a glance where that implant is in every orientation. So it looked great from the buccal view, but now that I'm looking at it from this, I can tell it needs to come over a little bit and angle a bit. You want to get that where it's coming right up through the long axis of the tooth and right through the central groove of the restoration. So I have the implant roughly positioned where I want. Everything looks like it's well within bone. I'm about 1 millimeter subcrestal, which is what I like to do with these Biomax implants. And finally, I would want to look at this 3D rendering and make sure I like where that screw emergence would be. And again, you can see how useful it is to see that abutment emerging through. That's where a screw access hole would be, and it's right through the center of the restoration. So I really like that. And at this point, we are ready to make the guide. I'm going to right-click the implant and lock it, again, just so I don't knock it out of position. And so before I make my guide, first thing I want to do is turn off the tooth, okay? So you've got your plus implant nerve and tooth up here, but then you've also got just these buttons without the plus sign. If I was to click these, those just turn on and off the visibility of the implant's nerves or teeth. I'm going to turn off the tooth. And now I want to go to Panels, Implant List. And you'll notice up here that I've got the abutment. That can be checked on or off, but you'll see that the guide tube right here is not checked on. You need to check that on. If you don't have a guide tube visible when you design the guide and make it, then you're just going to be making a night guard. It won't have any kind of a guide hole in it. Now you would choose your drill type. So in this case, let's do the fully guided surgical kit. And so the software, when you're using Blue Sky products, is going to automatically position that in the appropriate spot. I won't go into it. There is some variability. If you needed to move this tube up, there's ways to deal with that. But for this video, let's just keep it basic and turn on the guide tube for this, and let's make the guide. All right, now you can go to Panels, Guide Fabrication, and we'll go to Case 1 gingiva. That's the model we're creating this guide on. We want to lock the implants and the virtual teeth, use the automatic brush. I always choose high for the guide quality. Come down and choose mandible and then draw curve. Now draw curve, it's red, which means it's an active tool, and yet when I click on the screen, nothing is happening. To activate that tool, you have to push shift. And when I push shift, you see it turn into a crosshair. Once I do that and it's turned into a crosshair, I can left click and hold and begin drawing the outline of my surgical guide. At some point, you'll need to reorient, so you can let go of the shift key and reorient, and then just continue your line on. And I generally will go to the contralateral canine, come up and over. You'll notice I'm not making any effort to make these lines exactly touch one another, and I especially don't want them to cross over one another because that can be problematic. So just get in the general vicinity and continue your line on. All right, and that looks great. We'll stop it right there. Edit the curve now, and when you push edit curve, it's going to bring up the nodes where you can fine-tune the positioning of everything. All right, that looks good. And once you're happy with that, I generally try to go right about the CEJs of the teeth. Once you're happy with that, you will push Create Surgical Guide. And the software is now going to fabricate the surgical guide. It's going to incorporate the guide tube position into that guide and make a uniform 3mm thickness. That can be changed, but it's kind of buried in the settings. Generally 3mm is what you want. And there you have it. That is the surgical guide. If you want to add text to this, you can put in the patient's name. And with this tool, it's a little odd. You would position, the text stays stationary, and you would position the model behind the text however you would want it to show up. So if I positioned it that way and pushed apply text, it will emboss that into this. That way, if you've got multiple cases in cold sterilization, you can easily find them based on that text. The final thing you would probably want to do is to do a drill report. So File, Drill Report. And it will bring up just a bunch of screenshots. Now, if there were particular things you wanted in your drill report, you can always push this button right here, which takes a screenshot, and it would add it to these. But I'm going to just go with the stock photos. I can click to do a PDF. And if you wanted to put something in about the patient to help remind you, latex allergy, whatever you wanted to say, you can make this all on one page or one image per page. Let's just do all on one page. Here is the PDF that would be generated. It would incorporate any text that I wanted to do. And these are very useful for referring docs because they can print this off and they can send it back to the referring doctor, with their notes and whatnot on this. Okay, so that would be your drill report. I print this off and have this taped up behind the patient when doing implants. And really that is it. So we've got this surface now. It's our surgical guide. We could change colors if we wanted. But the only thing left to do is to export this. Okay, so everything we've done to this point is free with the Blue Sky software. The only time you incur a charge is when you export a surgical guide. And so if I go down here to export data, all of the surfaces in the case, the nerves, the STL model, everything is able to be exported. I want to uncheck everything except for my surgical guide. I usually, again, do high quality. And then I'm going to export, and you can see here it shows I have 46 remaining. As I export this, it's going to take one of those away. And it's one per case. So if you had, let's say, an upper and a lower guide on this same patient, or you messed it up and you wanted to go back and do it again, it's only one per case, so you wouldn't get charged again in this case. So I'm going to export. We'll call this just by my name, and save it on my desktop. And now that has taken away one of my exports, and I could come and open up this STL model. So that is really the entirety of the process. I went very slow on this case and did a lot of talking. On average, these are going to take me 10 minutes to complete a surgical guide for a single tooth. So it's a very efficient process, and the export is going to cost you under $20. So it's a very affordable process to do as well. Hope that was helpful.